in 11 through 13, you kind of get the culmination and the kind of putting together of the arguments that are made earlier in the book of Hebrews. And so, how does the book end? How does it draw that together? And what's the lesson to be learned from the arguments that have been laid out in the book?
It kind of summarizes the arguments and then uses them as kind of a source of encouragement then to so live. And it talks about not living encumbered by sin and lowly things. And it talks about this great cloud of witnesses who've gone before us. And it really is then a source that, if this relationship with God has been restored, and the culmination of all these arguments demonstrates that, then live accordingly.
Yeah, yeah. And so chapter 11 is probably the most famous part of the book of Hebrews. And, it talks about first these kind of great people of faith. So why are we going back to these Old Testament people?
Well, it starts off with, in chapter 11, this definition of faith, and then kind of talks about what all these Old Testament characters did by faith. And it shows that a lot of them didn't actually receive in their lifetime, what they were hoping for, what they were believing for, because it was culminated, later on, even beyond their lifetimes and stuff. And but it talks about the great things they accomplished and the great things they endured, and it was all by faith. And even though they didn't see in their lifetimes the culmination of this faith, that's the reality we now live with. And if we have this great cloud of witnesses, then we should run the race with an even greater faith.
Really, the faith is the trust or confidence in God and His glory, His good intention for us, the power of His salvation for us. All these Old Testament people, they did these amazing things, and yet they didn't receive any of that. We look back at the Old Testament people, and it's easy to criticize their shortcomings, and yet the point of this is that they form this great cloud of witnesses. And I thought when I was a kid and read this that the idea is they were witnesses of us. They were watching us, but really they're a witness to what? To the glory of God. What is it they're witness to?
They're witness of, and you could say the glory of God, but they're witness to the fact that the God they place their trust and confidence in delivered. That He was more than worth the trust and confidence they placed in Him.
A lot of them put their trust and confidence in God, and great things happen. But there's also a section of that chapter where it talks about some people put their trust in God, and their end maybe was not quite the Lifetime movie that we would hope for in our lives. And so what's the argument from that? Because that's kind of a strange part of the faith chapter is, by faith these guys conquered and they did all this kind of stuff. And then it goes on, well, but some of them didn't. Why include that, and what's the argument?
Well, I think we've got to recognize that there's a fair amount of suffering that we're going to experience, that we have experienced, and to kind of just pretend like that doesn't exist and things of this sort. Contrary to what some televangelists might have us believe, not all of our lives are going to end in some glorious success story of whatever, but that doesn't mean God's purposes aren't thwarted. The life that we live on this earth is just the smallest speck of the eternal life that goes from essentially here on.
The success that some people have in their faith is really a testament to the nature and character of God, and that nature and character of God is not somehow undone if the reward isn't received in our lifetime. They bear witness to the fact that we can trust God, and so even if we don't see that in our lifetime, even if we die quote unquote unsuccessfully, that it's really not unsuccessful if we put our faith in God, because there's a certainty of reward that comes from that. Why might the book of Hebrews have been designed and laid out the way that it is? If we go back to the first century and what was happening at that time, what's the purpose really here?
So very early on in the first century, persecution breaks out, and starts out a little bit as Jewish persecution, and then it's just complete Roman persecution, the entire empire. Um, and this idea that this trust in God that is maintained even in difficulty and death and things of this sort. That's the story of the Christian church. They say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the saints, and it's actually this faith and confidence in God in the face of death. We see this with Stephen. We get stories of Polycarp and burning at the stake and stuff like this, and they're powerful, and they actually, rather than being some measure of defeat, it's actually quite the opposite. It's actually dying in victory.
Yeah, and so, you can imagine somebody who was a first century Jewish Christian saying, well, if I leave Judaism and become a Christian, I leave a certain amount of safety and security, and I go into a place where I'm going to get persecuted. I'm going to get, maybe lose my life, or at least lose property, lose friends, lose connection with, my heritage and my past. And if I'm worshiping the same God, why would I pay this extra price? And so really, to sum up the argument, what is the answer to that question? Why would I, as a Jew, pay the extra price to worship the same God in this way versus the old way?
Because it's in every respect better. That's the argument that's being made, but also it is the fulfillment of the old way. The old way was incomplete, and was never designed to be completed apart from this. The old way was always designed to turn into this new way, and why would you stay with what's incomplete and which is not satisfactory to atone for sin, and not move on to what is complete and what does truly atone for sin, I guess, is really the argument. The old way was never supposed to just stay the old way. The old way was always supposed to turn into the new way, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like asking, if a woman has gotten an engagement ring and, the wedding is coming up, and the wedding day's here, everything's ready, and the groom is up at the altar, and she kind of comes up to the altar, and when asked if she, do you take this man, she says, well, I'd really rather just stay engaged. That's kind of the situation. Would you agree?
Sure, I hadn't thought of that. That's really well put, though. The whole point of being engaged is to get married.
Right. And so somebody, a woman who does that, there would be maybe a bit of an insult to the groom. But what's wrong with this idea for the Jewish people? Well, we're just going to stay here. We're just going to stay where we're at.
It's the whole point. You talk about the intimacy that's been revealed and stuff like this, and I think that's the rub. Is you want to stand to this old covenant? It's all been in place so that we could open the doorway to greater intimacy with God, but you want to stay back here?
Right, and so that's the idea, is you can't stay there, because once it's time to move on, if you don't want to move on, you didn't really want to be engaged. You didn't really love the God who was doing all of this, and so there's no option. You either go forward or you turn away completely. There's no real option to stay where you're at, and that's kind of the point, I think, behind this idea that there's a Sabbath rest, but it wasn't entered into because there was no faith. And if you don't trust that the marriage is going to be better than the engagement, then you can never move into the marriage.